The lights hit him like a wall of fire, and Commander Elias Vance raised his hand to shield his eyes from the blinding glare that poured down from above the arena floor. And for a moment he could see nothing but white and gold and the dancing shadows of 40,000 screaming aliens who had come to watch him. 11 months he had been a prisoner of the Korvathi Empire, and 11 months he had survived their labor camps and their torture chambers and their endless attempts to break his spirit. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, when the massive gates behind him slammed shut, and he stood alone on the hot sand of the Crucible. The Crucible was the most famous arena in 3 star systems, and every species in the known galaxy knew its name and feared it. For this was where the Korvathi Empire showed its power to the universe by feeding prisoners and slaves and captured warriors to their champions in front of cheering crowds that numbered in the tens of thousands. Elias looked down his body and saw what they had given him to fight with, and a bitter laugh escaped his cracked lips when he realized the joke they were playing on him. He wore nothing but torn rags that barely covered his skin, and in his right hand he held a small blade meant for cutting meat at a dinner table, not for fighting a warrior in combat. The crowd above him roared with laughter, and he could hear their voices, even though he did not understand most of their languages. But laughter sounds the same in every tongue, and he knew they were mocking him and calling him names and betting on how quickly he would fall. A massive screen floated in the air above the arena, and Elias saw his own face projected on it, pale and bloody and thin from months of starvation. And next to his image were words in the Korvathi language that he had learned to read during his imprisonment. The endurance pest, they called him, because humans had become known throughout the Empire as creatures who simply refused to die when they were supposed to. Announcer's voice boomed across the arena, like thunder rolling through mountains, and even though Elias could not understand every word, he understood enough to know that the announcer was promising the crowd quick and amusing death for the weak little human who dared to stand on their sacred sand. Then the gate on the opposite side of the arena began to rise, and the crowd erupted into cheers so loud that Elias felt them vibrating in his broken ribs. And from the darkness beyond that gate emerged the creature he was meant to fight. His name was Korvax, and he was a Volrathi, one of the most feared warrior species in the galaxy. And Elias had heard stories about him in the prison camps where other prisoners whispered his name like a curse. Korvax stood 9 feet tall, with 4 muscular arms that could tear a human apart like paper, and his body was covered in natural armor, plates that could stop most blades and even some energy weapons. The champion walked into the light with the confidence of a creature who had never known defeat, and the screen above showed his record in bright golden numbers. 200 consecutive kills in the arena without a single loss, and the crowd chanted his name over and over until the sound became a physical force that pressed down on Elias from all sides. Korvax looked at the human standing before him, and his face twisted into an expression that might have been a smile if his species had been capable of such a thing. And he spread all 4 of his arms wide as if to say, "This is what you send me?" And the crowd laughed even harder at the obvious mismatch. Elias said nothing because there was nothing to say. He simply watched his opponent and breathed slowly and steadily despite the pain in his chest. And he remembered everything his trainers had taught him back on Earth before the war, before his ship was captured, before everything he knew was taken from him. Humanity had never faced the Korvathi Empire in open war, but everyone knew it was coming. And the military had trained soldiers like Elias to survive and to observe and to learn about their future enemies. And now all of that training came flooding back as he studied the massive warrior before him. He noticed how Korvax favored his right side when he moved and how his upper arms were slightly longer. than his lower ones, and how his armor plates had small gaps at the joints where they connected. And he filed all of this information away in his mind, the way he had been trained to do. The arena fell quiet for just a moment as the announcer called for the fight to begin, and Elias felt time slow down around him as his heart beat steady and strong in his chest. And he thought about his home and his family and his species and everything they had built across the stars. He thought about how the Korvathi saw humans as weak and soft and fragile, as nothing more than pests to be crushed beneath their boots. And he thought about how wrong they were and how they would learn the truth soon enough. The Korvathi Empire had conquered 100 worlds and enslaved a dozen species, and they believed themselves to be the masters of the galaxy. But they had never met a species like humanity before. They had never faced creatures who could break and bleed and fall and somehow find the strength to stand back up. Again Elias tightened his grip on the small blade in his hand and planted his feet in the hot sand and raised his eyes to meet the gaze of the monster before him. And in that moment, he made a decision that would echo across the stars for generations to come. If he was going to die in this arena, then he would die showing the entire galaxy what humanity was made of. And he would make them remember his name and fear his species long after his body turned to dust. The bell rang, and Korvax charged forward with a roar that shook the arena walls, and Elias stood his ground and waited. Because the first lesson any human soldier learned was simple. Survival is not about winning the first battle, but about being ready to fight the next one. And Commander Elias Vance had every intention of fighting until his very last breath. The first blow came faster than Elias could track, and suddenly he was flying through the air with blood spraying from his mouth. And when he hit the sand, it felt like every bone in his body shattered at once. And the crowd above him exploded into wild cheering and laughter that filled the arena like a storm. Korvax had not even used his primary weapons. The champion had struck him with only his lower arms, as if the human was not worth the effort of a real attack. And now the massive Velrathi stood over his fallen opponent with all four arms raised in triumph, while the audience showered him with praise and adoration. Elias lay in the sand and felt the pain washing through his body like fire and ice mixed together. And for a moment the world went dark around the edges, and he thought this might be the end. But then he heard a voice in his head that sounded like his old drill sergeant back on Earth, screaming at him to get up and fight because death was not an excuse to stop trying. So he got up. His legs trembled beneath him and blood dripped from the gash across his ribs, but he found his footing and raised the small blade once more. And when Korvax turned around and saw the human standing again, the champion let out a bark of surprised laughter, and the crowd joined him in mocking the foolish creature who did not know when to stay down. Korvax walked toward him slowly this time, savoring the moment and playing to the audience the way a performer plays to his fans. And when he reached Elias, he struck him again with a casual backhand that sent the human spinning across the arena floor. The sand was rough against his torn skin, and Elias felt two of his ribs crack from the impact. And the world spun around him in a dizzy blur of lights and shadows. And the crowd roared their approval so loudly that the sound became physical and pressed against his ears like hands trying to crush his skull. But even as the darkness crept into his vision, and even as his body screamed at him to stop and give up and accept the peace of death, Elias pushed his hands against the ground and forced himself back to his feet once more. The laughter in the arena began to change. It was still there, but now there was something else mixed in with it. A note of confusion that crept into the voices of the watchers as they saw this broken creature refuse to accept what should have been obvious to anyone with eyes. Korvax tilted his head and looked at the human with what might have been curiosity. And then he shrugged with all four shoulders and attacked again with a strike that was harder than before. A blow meant to end this strange game once and for all. Elias went down again, and this time he felt something crack in his chest that made breathing feel like swallowing broken glass. And the pain was so intense that his vision went white, and he could not tell which way was up or down. But somewhere deep inside him, there was a fire that refused to go out. A spark of something that his species had carried with them since they first crawled out of the caves and looked up at the stars. He got back up, the laughter began to fade, and the arena grew quieter as more and more of the spectators stopped their jeering and simply watched what was happening below. They had seen thousands of fights in this arena, and they had seen prisoners beg and warriors rage and champions fall. But they had never seen anything quite like this. Korvax struck him down a fourth time, and the human rose again with blood streaming down his face and his left eye swollen shut. And the champion struck him a fifth time, and still the human found his feet somehow. And by the sixth time Korvax knocked into the sand, the crowd had fallen almost completely silent. There was no more laughter now and no more cheering. There was only a growing sense of something cold and unfamiliar that spread through the arena like frost creeping across glass. And the spectators shifted in their seats and looked at each other with expressions they did not quite understand. Corvs was no longer playing to the crowd. The champion had stopped his showboating, and now his attacks came faster and harder, driven by something that looked almost like desperation as he tried to put this human down for good. He grabbed Elias by the arm and twisted until the bones snapped with a sound that echoed through the silent arena. And then he threw the human against the arena wall, so hard that cracks appeared in the stone. Surely this would be enough. Surely no creature could survive such punishment. Surely this strange game would finally end. But Elias crawled out of the rubble with his broken arm hanging useless at his side, and he picked up his fallen blade with his remaining good hand, and he stood once more on legs that should not have been able to support him. And he looked at Korvax with eyes that held no fear and no anger and no desperation. There was only patience in those eyes. Endless and terrible patience, and something in Korvax's chest grew cold when he saw it. This human was not fighting to win, and he was not fighting to survive. He was waiting for something with the calm certainty of a predator who knows that time is on his side. The crowd of 40,000 aliens stared down at the arena floor in perfect silence, and for the first time in their lives, many of them felt an emotion that their species had long forgotten. An ancient fear that lived in the bones of every creature that had ever been hunted by something patient and relentless. They were beginning to understand that this human was not their entertainment. He was a message written in blood and broken bones. And the message was simple. You have not seen what we are capable of. You have not tested the limits of our endurance. And you have made a terrible mistake by thinking we would be easy to break. Korvax attacked again with all the fury he could summon. And Elias went down again with wounds that should have killed him 10 times over. And the crowd held their breath and waited to see if the impossible would happen once more. The human rose. The silence in the arena was so complete that Elias could hear his own blood dripping onto the sand, each drop making a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. 40,000 spectators sat frozen in their seats and watched with wide eyes as the broken human stood once more before the greatest champion their empire had ever known. Korvax stood 10 feet away with his chest heaving from exertion that he had never felt before in 200 fights, and his 4 hands were clenched into fists that trembled with something that was not rage. The champion looked at the creature before him, and for the first time in his life, he did not know what to do. This was not how fights were supposed to go. Prisoners were supposed to cower and beg. Warriors were supposed to fight with honor until their strength gave out. and victims were supposed to die when you killed them. But this human followed none of those rules and broke every expectation with each impossible moment he continued to breathe. The screen above the arena showed a close-up of Elias's face, and every being in the crowd could see the damage that had been done to him. His left eye was completely swollen shut. Blood covered half his face from a gash on his forehead. His lips were split and torn, and dark bruises were spreading across every inch of visible skin, and yet his one good eye remained clear and focused and fixed on his opponent with an intensity that made some of the spectators in the front rows lean back in their seats as if they could feel that gaze touching them. Korvax made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a question, a noise that asked how this could be happening. Odegia, to be happening. And then he charged forward with renewed fury, because he was a champion, and champions did not lose to broken prey. His upper right arm came down in a hammering blow that was meant to crush the human skull. But Elias moved at the last possible moment with a speed that should have been impossible for someone so damaged. The blow missed by inches, and Korvax stumbled forward, surprised and off balance for just a heartbeat. But a heartbeat was all Elias needed to see what he had been waiting for, the way the champion's weight shifted when he overextended. The tiny gap that opened between the armor plates on his neck. The fraction of a second when all four arms were committed to an attack and could not defend, he filed this information away and let himself be struck by the champion's follow-up blow. A punch that sent him rolling across the sand and opened new wounds on top of the old ones. The pain was beyond anything he had ever imagined, but pain was just information. Just his body telling him he was still alive. Elias rose again, and the silence in the arena somehow grew even deeper, becoming a weight that pressed down on everyone present, like the gravity of a dying star. Some of the spectators had begun to whisper prayers to gods they had not believed in since childhood, because what they were witnessing felt like something from ancient legends rather than a simple arena fight. Korvax attacked again and again, each blow more desperate than the last. He stopped trying to end the fight quickly and started trying to cause as much damage as possible, breaking bones and tearing flesh in ways that should have been fatal instantly. He shattered the human's right leg and watched him collapse and felt certain that this would finally be the end. But Elias did not try to stand this time. Instead, he began to crawl, dragging himself through the sand with his one good arm while his broken limbs trailed behind him. And he kept his eye fixed on Korvax the entire time with that same terrible patience that had begun to haunt the champion's thoughts. "Why won't you die?" Korvax screamed in his own language, and even though Elias did not understand the words, he understood the fear behind them. And something that might have been a smile crossed his bloody face. The answer was simple, but Korvax would never understand it. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy, and they were not the fastest or the smartest or the most advanced. But they carried something inside them that no other species possessed in quite the same way. They had evolved on a death world where every day was a battle for survival. And their ancestors had faced predators and plagues and ice ages and extinction events. And through it all, they had simply refused to stop trying. Giving up was not in their nature, because the humans who gave up had died millions of years ago, and only the stubborn ones survived to pass on their genes. Generation after generation of creatures who looked at impossible odds and said, "I will try anyway," and kept going until their hearts stopped. Beating Korvax grabbed Elias and lifted him off the ground with all four arms and brought him close to his face so he could look into the human's remaining eye, searching for some sign of surrender or desperation or the acceptance of death that he had seen in hundreds of opponents before, but there was nothing like that in the human's gaze. There was only that endless patience and something else that Korvax finally recognized with a chill that ran through all 3 of his hearts. The human was studying him, learning him, memorizing every detail of how he moved and fought and where his defenses were. Weak every single blow that Korvax had landed was not just punishment for the human. It was a lesson, a chance to observe the champion's techniques up close. And Elias had been paying attention with the focus of a predator, learning the patterns of its prey. The hunter had become the hunted, and Korvax finally understood that he was not fighting a victim. He was fighting something that had been waiting for exactly the right moment. Conserving what little strength it had left for one final chance, he threw the human away in sudden panic and watched him hit the sand and lie still. And for one beautiful moment, Korvax believed it was finally over. But then the human's hand began to move, searching through the sand for the small blade he had dropped. And Korvax felt real fear flood through his body for the first time since he was a child. The crowd watched in horrified fascination as the broken human found his blade and began to rise once more. And they knew with sudden terrible certainty that they were about to witness something that would change everything they believed about the universe and their place in it. Elias could feel his body failing with each breath he took. His broken ribs ground against each other like shards of glass. His shattered leg refused to support any weight, and the blood loss was making the world spin around him in slow, dizzy circles that threatened to pull him down into darkness forever. But none of that mattered because he had found what he was looking for. The pattern, the weakness, the one moment when Korvax left himself open to a counterattack. And now all he needed was the strength for one final move. Korvax stood across from him with fear visible in every line of his massive body. And the champion was breathing hard and looking at the human like he was seeing a ghost or a demon or something. Worse than either. His forehands kept opening and closing as if he could not decide whether to attack or retreat. The silence in the arena had become so heavy that it felt like a living thing pressing down on everyone present. And some of the spectators had covered their eyes because they could not bear to watch what was coming, but they also could not bring themselves to leave. Elias took a step forward on his broken leg, and the pain that shot through his body was so intense that his vision went white. But he forced himself to take another step and then another, dragging himself toward the champion with the blade clutched tight in his one working hand. "Stay back," Korvax snarled in his own language. And even though Elias did not understand the words, he heard the terror behind them and knew that he had already won half the battle. The champion, who had killed 200 opponents, was afraid of a broken human who could barely stand. Korvax made his decision and charged forward with a roar that was meant to sound fierce but came out desperate instead. And his upper right arm came down in the same hammering blow that he had used a dozen times before, because it was his strongest attack and his most reliable kill. But this time Elias was ready. He had watched that blow come down on him again and again, memorizing the exact angle of the arm and the precise moment when Korvax's weight shifted forward and left him vulnerable. And now his body moved without conscious thought in the pattern his trainers had drilled into him thousands of times. He twisted to the side at the last possible instant and felt the champion's fist brush past his face so close that he could feel the wind of its passage. And then he was inside Korvax's guard with the blade in his hand, and time seemed to slow down around him as he saw his target clearly. For the first time, the gap between the armor plates on Korvax's neck was small, not wider than 2 human fingers, but it was enough. Elias drove the meat knife forward with every ounce of strength he had left and felt the blade slide between the plates and sink deep into the soft flesh. Beneath, Korvax made a sound that was half scream and half gurgle as his hands came up to grab at the weapon stuck in his throat. And his eyes went wide with disbelief as he stared down at the human who had done the impossible. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees with a crash that shook the arena floor. The champion of 200 fights looked at Elias with something that might have been respect or might have been terror. And then his eyes went dark, and he toppled forward into the sand and lay still for one heartbeat. The arena remained frozen in silence. And then that silence shattered into something beyond chaos as the crowd erupted into screams and shouts and cries of disbelief. Some of them were crying, and some of them were praying, and some of them were simply staring with their mouths open because they could not process what they had just witnessed. Elias stood over the fallen champion with blood pouring from his countless wounds, and his body swaying like a tree in a storm. And he knew that he should collapse and let the darkness take him, because there was nothing left in his body that could keep him upright for another moment. But he had one more thing to do before he could rest. He raised his head and looked up at the Imperial viewing box where the Kovathi High Marshal sat surrounded by his generals and advisors. And even from this distance, Elias could see the shock on their faces and fear in their eyes as they realized what had just happened. The arena's acoustic systems were designed to carry sound from anywhere on the fighting floor to every corner of the stadium. And Elias knew that whatever he said next would be heard by every single being in attendance. His voice came out as a broken rasp, but the microphones picked it up and amplified it until his words echoed like thunder. "My species has a saying," he said, and he had to pause to spit blood before he could continue. "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." He locked eyes with the High Marshal and refused to look away, even as his vision began to fade around the edges. "Your empire has never been punched," he continued, and his voice grew stronger with each word, as if the act of speaking was giving him strength he did not know he had. "You have conquered 100 worlds and enslaved a dozen species, and you think you know what war looks like. But you have never faced anything like us." He gestured at the fallen champion and at his own broken body and at the blood-soaked sand that surrounded them both. "Consider this your first punch." Then his legs finally gave out and he collapsed to his knees beside his fallen opponent. But he kept his head up and his eyes open because he refused to show weakness even now. The crowd stared at him in stunned silence, and the High Marshal gripped the arms of his throne so hard that the metal began to bend beneath his fingers. The message had been delivered, and there was nothing anyone could do to take it back. Every being in that arena would remember this moment for the rest of their lives, and they would tell others about what they had seen. And the story would spread across the galaxy like wildfire until every species knew the truth about humanity. They were not prey, and they were not victims, and they were not easy to kill. They were survivors who had crawled out of the mud of a death world and conquered their own planet and reached for the stars. And they would keep reaching until they either won or died trying. And the Kovathi Empire had just learned the hard way that killing them might be harder than anyone had ever imagined. 3 days after the fight that shook the Kovathi Empire to its core, Commander Elias Vance walked through the gates of the prisoner compound for the last time. His body was wrapped in bandages and held together by alien medicine that his doctors said should have been impossible to use on a human. But somehow his cells had accepted the treatment and begun the long process of healing. The ancient laws of the Crucible were clear and unbreakable. Any warrior who killed a reigning champion in single combat must be granted their freedom, no matter their crime or their species or their status as a prisoner. These laws had been written 3,000 years ago when the Kovathi believed that such a thing could never happen, and no one had ever thought to change them. Now the Empire was trapped by its own traditions, and the High Marshal had no choice but to sign the order for the humans' release, even though every instinct in his body screamed at him to have the creature executed before it could cause any more damage. But the damage was already done, and there was nothing anyone could do to undo it. Footage of the fight had spread across every network in the galaxy within hours. And by the time the sun rose on the second day, there was not a single inhabited world that had not seen the human rise again and again. And again Elias limped through the spaceport with a Kovathi escort that kept their distance from him as if they were afraid he might attack them despite his injuries. And other travelers stopped and stared as he passed by. Some of them pointed and whispered, and others simply watched in silence. And he could see in their eyes that they recognized him from the videos. He boarded a transport ship bound for neutral space, where human diplomats were waiting to bring him home. And as the ship lifted off from the surface, he looked out the window at the world that had tried so hard to kill him and felt something that might have been pity for the beings who lived there. They had no idea what was coming. In the High Marshal's war room far below, generals and admirals and strategists gathered around a massive holographic display that showed the borders of the Kovathi Empire and the small cluster of stars where humanity had built their civilization. They had come to discuss the threat that one human had revealed and to decide how the Empire should respond. "We should strike now before they have a chance to prepare," one general argued, his forearms waving in agitation as he pointed at the human worlds on the map. "One soldier cannot represent an entire species, and if we hit them hard and fast, we can crush them before they become a real threat. You saw the same footage we all saw," another general replied with fear obvious in his voice. "That human took punishment that would have killed any of us 3 times over, and he kept getting up. If their soldiers can all do that, then a war against them would cost us more than we can afford to lose." The debate continued for hours as the generals argued back and forth about strategy and tactics and the proper response to what they had witnessed. But the High Marshal sat in silence and listened without contributing a word. His eyes were fixed on the holographic display, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He was remembering the moment when the human had looked up at him from the arena floor and spoken those words that still echoed in his thoughts. "Consider this your first punch." There had been no rage in the human's voice, and no desperation, and no pride. There had only been certainty, the absolute unshakable belief that he was delivering a truth that the entire galaxy needed to hear. And the High Marshal had felt something cold settle in his chest when he heard it. Raised one hand, and the arguing generals fell silent immediately. And he spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Pull up everything we have on humanity," he ordered, and his aides rushed to obey. Within moments, the holographic display was filled with data about the strange species from the backwater world called Earth, including their history and their wars and their culture. Marshall began to read, and the more he read, the colder that feeling in his chest became. He saw records of human conflicts that stretched back thousands of years. Wars fought with primitive weapons, and then with machines, and then with weapons that could destroy entire cities in a single flash of light. He saw something called the Siege of Stalingrad, where humans had fought for months in frozen ruins and eaten rats and leather and each other rather than surrender their city to an enemy. And he saw something called the Bataan Death March, where captured soldiers had walked for days through brutal heat while their captors tried to break their spirits, and most of them had simply refused to break. He saw images of humans climbing mountains that should have killed them and crossing deserts that should have been impossible, and diving to depths where the pressure should have crushed their fragile bodies. And in every case, they had survived through nothing but stubborn refusal to accept their own limitations. "What are these creatures?" one of the generals whispered, and there was genuine horror in his voice. Marshall stared at the data for a long time, and then he made a decision that had never been made in the entire history of the Kovathi Empire. He stood up from his throne and looked at his generals with eyes that held no room for argument. Issue a standing order to all fleet commanders. There will be no expansion into human space until further notice. And any ship that encounters human vessels will retreat rather than engage. The generals erupted into protests and demands for explanation, but the marshal silenced them with a single raised hand. A species that treats death as an inconvenience is not one we should fight until we understand. What makes them keep rising? He said. And his voice was heavy with the weight of what he was admitting. That human in the arena was not surviving. He was sending a message, and I intend to listen to it before we start a war we might not be able to win, far away across the stars. Ilis Vance sat in the medical bay of a human diplomatic vessel and watched through the window as the Korvathi Empire grew smaller behind him. His body ached with 1,000 different pains, but for the first time in 11 months, he felt something that might have been PC had done what he set out to do, and the message had been delivered. Humanity was no longer unknown and no longer underestimated. And the next time the Empire thought about attacking his people, they would remember the day a broken human killed their greatest champion with a meat knife, and somewhere deep in the heart of human space, military commanders were watching the footage of his fight and taking notes and making plans. They knew that war with the Korvathi was still coming. Maybe not today, and maybe not tomorrow, but someday soon. And when it came, they would be ready. They would show the galaxy what humanity could really do when they were not alone and broken and armed with nothing but a dinner knife. They would show them what happened when humans fought together with all the weapons and ships and technology their civilization could provide, and the Korvathi Empire would learn that the arena had only been the beginning.